The same thing could apply theoretically to Anadrol, where you can literally get away with using half the dosage, get a spike in plasma concentrations twice as high as what you would get from the oral dose, and the spike is so much more aggressive that you can actually get a more enhanced performance outcome potentially in a more compressed time frame, thus allowing you to What's up guys, Derek, moreplates.com. Today we're going to be talking about a pretty science-heavy topic, so if you don't want to hear a lot of scientific jargon, this is not going to be a layman's terms video. This is going to be a theory I developed that I think is pretty fucking interesting and pretty sound for those who are interested in bodybuilding pharmacology, performance enhancement, as well as minimizing androgenic side effects, either for, hair loss or for other reasons, or even in the context of maybe even women. So anyways, this is all theoretical at the end of the day, but this is something that I've been sort of mulling around for a while in my head in terms of just more and more things adding up that make it seem like a more and more interesting theory. So Anadrol is not known as a hair-safe compound. It's actually known as one of the most powerful anabolic steroids, well, the most powerful oral anabolic steroids for muscle building, strength building, but also androgenic activity. So the thing about Anadrol though is it's kind of the consensus around the compound is this super androgenic, super powerful compound, super liver toxic. But what is often overlooked is the dosages being deployed. So when this was first being developed, it was evaluated at dosages as low as like 2.5 milligrams a few times a day. And now when you look at the dosage prescribed to children, the recommended daily dose on rxlist.com in children and adults is 1 to 5 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day. The usual effective dose is 1 to 2 milligrams per kilogram per day, but higher doses may be required, and the dose should be individualized. Response is not often immediate, and a minimum trial of 3 to 6 months should be given. Following remission, some patients may be maintained without the drug, others may be maintained on an established lower daily dosage. A continued maintenance dose is usually necessary in patients with congenital aplastic anemia. So even these websites that are literal official, pamphlet inserts or medical recommendations in a clinical setting of these drugs are essentially saying that if a bodybuilder was going to use it, a minimum effective dose would be like 100 milligrams a day. And the dosage would be even higher potentially at several hundred milligrams a day. And this is like one of the few anabolics where the recommended dose is like significantly higher than what is actually what I would consider, or many would consider, to be the minimum effective dose for actual muscle building purposes relative to the side effect profile, like where you would get away with whatever the minimum doses you can yield a max benefit with a relative lack of side effects. And I actually did a video a while ago on 50 milligrams of Anadrol versus 100 milligrams of Anadrol, and they found that the results were not significantly different, and it would not justify doubling the dose up to the triple digits at 100 milligrams. They found that 50 milligrams per day built 3.3 kilograms of lean body mass relative to 4.2 kilograms, doubling the dose. So only 0.9 kilograms of additional lean body mass gain for doubling the dose of Anadrol. And as far as fat loss goes, the 50 milligram group actually lost an extra 0.1 kilogram of fat. So like at the end of the day, the amount of difference between the muscle growth induced was, not overly significant to the point where it would justify literally doubling the dose of a liver toxic, lipid crushing steroid. It's hard to justify, making that jump from 50 to 100 when you're getting like 75 to 80% of the results using half the dose. So this is one of the interesting scenarios in which the medical literature is saying to use a dose way higher than what would otherwise probably be necessary. Like obviously they're talking about in a totally different context than what we would be looking at it for in a performance enhancement context. So this is where it gets interesting though, because a lot of people, they defer to these dosage protocols in the clinical, medical history books, essentially, seeing like 100 plus milligrams is like the effective dose, and that's what you need. And then obviously when people use it, they get significant androgenic side effects. And the reason being is the compound itself does have some, like good myotrophic to androgenic activity in the literature. It's just almost every single anabolic steroid, once you get to a certain dosage, you're going to hit a giant wall of anabolic returns relative to your dose, and you're just going to have an increasing exponential amount of side effects. So it's kind of like at a certain dose, all you're really doing is stacking on minimal additional anabolic benefit and really cranking up the side effect profile. And that's the same goes with Anadrol. The same goes with, even if you use a high enough dose of Anavar, you're going to have severe viralization in women. This is why they have to stick to 5 to 10 milligrams, or else they start to encounter issues, especially with the prolonged duration of exposure that they're putting themselves through to grow in the off season. So Anadrol, we're looking at dosages like, 50 to 100 milligrams, going to cause severe viralization. It's going to cause androgenic side effects in men, hair loss, etc. But when you actually dig into, and this is one thing I want to cover quickly too, as far as studies on hair loss goes, if you dig into the actual trials done on like most synthetic anabolic androgenic steroids, they have such favorable, disproportionately favorable hair loss statistics that are like totally fucking useless. Like they cannot be used as a reference point whatsoever. If you look at any of the Anadrol data, you see like the most ridiculous shit. Like, first of all, I'm going to be talking about why Anadrol may be hair safe, but the first thing I want to outline is how dumb and useless these studies on humans are, where we look at alopecia data. And the reason being, it takes a while for you to have severe miniaturization to the point where you would actually classify yourself as having hair loss. It often takes guys several cycles before they even realize they're losing hair, because it does not happen overnight. Rather, it is a progressive process over years where you are miniaturizing hair follicles on your head, and then the cosmetic representation of thinning or diffuse thinning or recession only becomes apparent after you've done, if you're not severely prone to balding, after several blasts down the line, when you start to see the manifestation of the expedited hair loss occurring on your head. So in these studies where they're evaluating like a 3 to 6 month blast of a synthetic anabolic, and then they say, oh, like 5% of the patients had alopecia, it's like the most misleading fucking shit ever, because they're basically implying that it's hair safe when in fact they're like, none of them are, like Primobolan, we have, well tolerated up to 1200 milligrams in women, and it's like not super high incidence of alopecia. I guarantee you, if you're prone to hair loss and you take more than 600 milligrams of Primo, your hair's gonna be shredded. Same goes for Masteron. The same goes for Anadrol. When you see the Anadrol data, you see in women tolerating it well with like minimal hirsutism. You see barely any hair loss or alopecia in these studies. And the most ridiculous of all is, even in studies where they have, like, just to show an example of how ridiculous some of this shit is when you even look at some of the data where females are literally transitioning to men using testosterone on purpose to go from female to male. You don't even have half of them getting androgenic alopecia. You literally have chicks injecting themselves with fucking testosterone and not all of them experiencing hair loss, even though every single fucking dude, 99% of people are going to eventually experience hair loss. And the reason why they don't in these studies is because the duration of exposure is not long enough to realize these side effects. Like here in this study, this is testosterone therapy for transgender men. And this was basically in this, facial hair, androgenetic alopecia, and acne were assessed with validated instruments in a prospective study of 20 transgender men who took intramuscular testosterone undecanoate for 1 year, and in a cross-sectional study of another 50 transgender men who had been on various testosterone formulations for about 10 years. In the prospective study, the median Fairman-Galloway score increased from 0 to 5 at baseline and 12 to 0 at 1 year, with the inter-individual variability from 2 to 25. In the cross-sectional study of long-term treatment, the median Fairman-Galloway score was 24, with a range of 6 to 34. 1 of 20 individuals developed mild frontotemporal hair loss during the prospective study, based on the Norwood-Hamilton classification system for hair loss. By contrast, long-term testosterone therapy resulted in mild frontotemporal hair loss in 33%, 16 of 50 participants, and moderate to severe alopecia in 31%, 15 to 50. Based on the gradual acne grading scale, prevalence of facial acne increased from 35% at baseline to 82% at 1 year, with a corresponding increase in back or chest acne from 15 to 88%. So you're saying the acne increased to almost like 90% of individuals, but the hair loss was only like 30%, even though in men with actual physiologic testosterone levels that are based on a diurnal pulsatile rhythm throughout the day being secreted normally, versus somebody who has a constant bleed of undecanoate in their system, somehow these transitioning females to males are somehow able to avoid hair loss when they're using exogenous T, but then every guy with normal testosterone levels that is not on a consistent bleed throughout the day and actually dips below normal, below those levels that the transgenders are exposing themselves to 24 hours a day. These guys, 99% of them get hair loss, and then on this side of the spectrum, we have like 3 people, 33% getting bad hair loss, 33% getting mild, and then the rest of them getting like fucking none. Like, obviously it's not the case. Let's see. Another prospective study of 53 transgender men who took intramuscular testosterone undecanoate for 1 year. 17% of participants developed androgenetic alopecia based on the Norwood-Hamilton classification system. In this study, no cases of severe acne were reported. Blah, blah, blah. In another study of transgender men who used intramuscular testosterone undecanoate for 24 months, 16% of individuals developed so-called troublesome acne. Although alopecia is an undesired effect for some transgender men, it can be desirable for others because it is considered a masculine feature. So anyways, like the 53 transgender men take test for a year, and only 17% of them develop male pattern baldness. Does that mean that fucking 4 out of 5 men are not going to experience baldness? No, you just haven't had it happen yet. It is going to happen. It just has not yet. You're going to get there though. Same thing with all the other anabolic steroids. So when you have these studies saying, oh, like fucking 4% of chicks who took Anadrol had no hair loss, it's like, yeah, you have 120,000 immaculate fucking follicles on your head that haven't been miniaturized yet. If you blast yourself with a bunch of Masteron, is your hair going to be safe? Maybe for the first blast. Is it going to long-term? Fuck no, it's gonna expedite things. That's how it works. So these studies can be essentially disregarded, in my opinion, and you have to go largely off of, you can use this as a reference point, sure, but when you actually dig into it, you have to refer to anecdotal feedback a lot of the time in the community based on what these compounds actually do in a real life setting in men who are already prone to male pattern baldness, and seeing it expedite it or not causing any issues, or being far more problematic than another compound. And this is sort of where we see Anadrol is not the most hair safe compound at the dosages being deployed. And then this sort of ties back to where my theory comes in, where I theorize that if a lower dosage was deployed, it's actually more well tolerated. And you actually see in women, interestingly enough, some, I guess, progressive coaches or coaches who sort of have a better idea of the anabolic to androgenic potency of some of these compounds, have sort of, and I guess it depends on the, I don't know, the tolerance of the female for body composition outcomes in the off season, whether they prefer being bloated looking versus dry and cosmetically pleasing with something like Anavar. But it seems like milligram for milligram, Anadrol, pound for pound, can produce perhaps even more muscle growth than Anavar with a even lower amount of androgenicity. And this is even when it is producing the mestanolone metabolite, which is what is believed to be the androgenic components of it. And this is sort of what I want to circle back to, is averting the metabolism of this byproduct that is actually the androgenic components of the hormone itself. And this is sort of where my theory comes in. And I'm not saying it is, more tissue selective than Anavar. It just seems like in practical application, when the dosage is actually scaled back to a much more reasonable lower amount, the drastic issues that you see with the liver toxicity, the blah, blah, blah. And again, keep in mind, this is like, a lot of it is me kind of just like throwing my ideas out there. Anadrol is like the only carcinogenic compound there is. It's a known carcinogen out of all of these synthetic anabolics. So I am in no way asserting that this is safer, it's better, whatever. I am just laying out sort of what I'm finding interesting, but don't take it as me saying you should do this, okay? So, and I know that might be hard to get from the way I am talking about it, but I assure you, Anadrol is not safe. It's just I'm trying to lay out a framework for sort of some ideas that have been coming to my head. So anyways, at a much lower dosage, it seems like the androgenic effects are much less of an issue in a performance enhancing context for those who are androgen sensitive, whether that be women, whether that be guys prone to male pattern baldness. And it is often just at these higher dosages where individuals run into issues and start to encounter some of the traditional like androgenic side effect outcomes. And as we've seen, there's a pretty blatant drop off in terms of anabolic returns relative to milligram used, and the androgenic effects realized at those higher dosages. So in theory, could you not, I don't know, use 10 milligrams of Anadrol versus 10 milligrams of Anavar and get a similar muscle building outcome with a relative lack of androgenicity? Like, I don't know. It seems like some of the coaches I've talked to, it seems like that actually may be the case. And that's in a female context. Like girls are using like, 2.5 or, like 5 milligrams of Anavar, like relatively long-term. And, I was thinking in my head, like, what is there coaches out there using 5 milligrams of Anadrol instead? And it seems like there are, and it seems like it sort of actually has some practical application. And that sort of circles back to men who are, androgen sensitive and prone to hair loss. Potentially, maybe it has some therapeutic applications in 10 milligram, 20 milligram range, something like that. And this is sort of what I want to get back to is with the mestanolone. So basically, the androgenicity from Anadrol is largely derived from its metabolism into something called mestanolone after oxidation in the liver at the C2 position. So the C2 hydroxymethylene group of oxymetholone is what is cleaved to form mestanolone, which is also known as 17-alpha methyl DHT, which sounds fucking horrible, and that's because it probably is. And the thing I first theorized is perhaps you could inject this to bypass that metabolism process. And I think that's probably somewhat true. Like at least you can skip first pass and you can get the majority of the metabolism just like, averted entirely potentially, and yield a more hair safe compound. And the reason why that to me is interesting too is because first of all, Anadrol is a poor substrate for 3-alpha hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. So that prevents it from being broken down in the muscle as easily and accounts for why it is so anabolic, or at least we theorize why it's so anabolic, despite it having terrible affinity for the AR. But that doesn't account for the response elements it kind of elicits and the kind of byproduct interaction it has with other satellite hormones, or satellite receptors, I should say. But it is very unique in that regard where it has a nearly undetectable binding affinity. I don't know if mestanolone itself is the thing that has a higher binding affinity and sort of drives the adrenergic signaling or not, which is sort of what accounts for why Anadrol gives you instant strength gains. And this is why a lot of people use it pre-workout, is it can drive this kind of redline your sympathetic nervous system essentially and basically give you instant performance outcomes. I don't know if this is mostly driven throughout the mestanolone metabolite or not, but if it wasn't and it was largely the parent compound, this would be like a fucking breakthrough in my opinion, because you could get rid of the mestanolone simply through administration practices. So this is where, if you actually look at the binding affinity for androgen receptors, anabolic steroids bind to the AR with different affinities. When you actually look at the relative binding affinities of them, and you look at halo testing, you look at Proviron, you look at D-bol, you look at Primobolan, you look at Nandrolone, Anavar, and you compare it to that of titrated methyltrianolone, a steroid resembling trend but with a 17-alpha alkyl, I can never fucking say this word, alkyl substituent to androgen receptors in cytosol isolated from skeletal muscle and the prostate gland of the rat and skeletal muscle of the rabbit. Obviously, these are animal models, but anyways, just bear with me for a sec. So the order of relative binding affinities in comparison with methyltrianolone, which had the strongest affinity, was Nandrolone, then Primobolan, then testosterone, then Mesterolone. Let's see, a group which had relatively high and generally similar affinity for the androgen receptor in all three tissues. These investigators did not rank 17-alpha methyl testosterone, but it had a relative binding affinity of 0.1, which made it an efficient competitor. The relative binding affinity of, I believe this is halotestin, dianabol, and winstrol was much weaker And that with oxymetholone, which is Anadrol, and ethyl estranol was too low to be determined. So oxymetholone Anadrol had a binding affinity that was so low for AR that it could not even be measured in this binding assay study. Does that necessarily mean it's void of androgenic activity? No, but I believe that its oxidation in the liver at the C2 position is largely what yields this mestanolone metabolite, which probably accounts for the majority of its inherent androgenic activity. Now, hopefully this isn't also what is driving, it doesn't seem to be what's driving the hypertrophy outcomes of Anadrol. Maybe it is partially what is driving the adrenergic signaling though, which would be unfortunate if you kind of like bypass that, because that would be largely the point of using this compound to begin with. But anyways, let's just, stay hopeful that that is not the thing that is doing it. And in fact, it is the parent compound Anadrol, because if that were the case, you could, in theory, if you were going to inject it, obviously maybe that would work. But in addition to that, I started to wonder about sublingual administration. And obviously you could look at things like rectal administration too, but just for the sake of simplicity and actual like real life application for the majority of individuals, sublingual is the thing I was looking at the most. And the reason why I even thought of this is estradiol. When I was doing my nandrolone monotherapy experiment, the DECA only thing, I dug really hard into the pharmacokinetics of oral bioavailable estradiol, micronized estradiol. And I found that the main drawback of oral estradiol was the fact that in the liver, during first pass, it would produce a ridiculous amount of estrone, and it would basically destroy the majority of the estradiol. So you would end up with a disproportionately high estrone relative to estradiol ratio, which probably isn't the healthiest thing. And this is often what you see with some of these oral compounds is during first pass, they produce a myriad of metabolites that are essentially, you have no idea what kind of inherent anabolic and androgenic activity those metabolites have. Like they could potentially be what drives the benefits of a certain compound, and it's not even the parent compound itself. And this is sort of where it gets into like mind-blown territory where like you're just fucking speculating at if this is what's happening or not. And this is largely, I think, why injectable LGD was such a big fail when I did that experiment, and it was super androgenic when I used it. And when people try these injectable SARMs, they're often very androgenic, is not only because they have way more bioavailability, or at least some of them are almost fully bioavailable when they're orally administered anyways, but when you inject some of them, not only do they have full bioavailability, but they're skipping the first pass and not producing some of these weird metabolite compounds that may have their own inherent, binding affinity, dissociation rate, anabolic to androgenic potency, etc. So Anadrol, when you're skipping the first pass, you're skipping this metabolism to a large extent into mestanolone, similar to how you would do with estradiol. So when you look at the pharmacokinetics of estradiol, we see estrogen levels after a single dose of estradiol by different routes. And we can see here, oral, when you actually look at E2 levels versus E1 levels in picograms per milliliter, or picograms, I always say that wrong. E2 to E1 ratio, you can see it's complete shit, 0.15, 0.16, 0.1. So this is the E2 to E1 ratio. This is not a representative of a physiologic amount. If you were actually producing a normal amount of estradiol, you would have a much more normal ratio. You would not have 0.15 of E2 estradiol relative to a sky high amount of E1. Like that's just not how it would occur. You would have something much closer to what you see with sublingual administration, where you have here E2 levels spike up and E1 levels spike up much less, where you have a ratio of 3:1 of estradiol to estrone. So this is a more representative of a physiologic, healthy ratio, and it is only accomplished through sublingual, or you can get it through transdermal or injecting, but you're not going to get it through just straight up like popping a tab and letting it go through the liver fully and produce all these fucking metabolites and destroy almost the entire parent compound. So this is the thing that was interesting to me, because for me, for all intents and purposes, this ratio, when I was looking at the estrone the estradiol pharmacokinetics orally, all I was thinking was this E2 is essentially the Anadrol, and this E1 is essentially the mestanolone. you know, the same thing is happening when you ingest it orally, it gets broken down a shit ton in the liver. You produce all of these, you know, unknown metabolites, and the ratio of them is like disproportionately unfavorable potentially if the parent hormone is in fact the tissue selective anabolic that is driving the majority of the outcomes you want, and the metabolites are driving the side effects that you don't want. And of course, this is just speculation that that is the thing that's causing the side effects. Maybe mestanolone is actually super necessary at a reasonable amount through that liver conversion to get some of the adrenergic signaling, some of the performance outcomes. But anyways, I'm just assuming based on the myotrophic to androgenic ratio of Anadrol and the fact that it's not broken down in the muscle, and the mestanolone is very androgenic on paper from what I've seen, it seems almost like we're looking at something like testosterone versus DHT, and the actual anabolic driver of hypertrophy outcomes is the Anadrol component. So that is what we would ideally want to focus on maximizing and minimizing the amount of in a hair loss context, not in a overall fucking health and performance context, obviously. So anyways, I know this is getting all over the map here, but basically, so I was starting to think about, okay, sublingual administration of oral anabolic steroids. And you also, you know, avoid some of the liver stress potentially because you're skipping first pass. So less, you know, cranking of your liver enzymes, less stress overall in the organ. Probably a good thing. In addition to that, the spike in serum concentrations is very aggressive when you do it sublingual. You get this giant spike and peak in plasma concentrations and then a big crash. So why would this be beneficial for an oral? It would be beneficial in my opinion because these are compounds that are often deployed to leverage their performance outcomes in a burst context. So for me, if I was to try and break through a strength plateau deep into an off season, that would be the only time that would make sense for me to deploy an oral compound. And, you know, obviously the placing of it in a pre-contest scenario, maybe you want some of the liver stress to crush your appetite or whatever. But let's just, you know, just talking in a hypertrophy and like driving performance context, the only time it really makes sense is deep in an off season where you're trying to break through like a very bad like plateau you've had in your programming. Like obviously you could just, you know, end this fucking blast phase there and call it quits because, you know, increasing food, increasing your fucking, any kind of other factors haven't worked yet. It's sort of like a last, you know, trick up your sleeve sort of thing. But this is just an interesting thing I found, and just like, bear with me here because it may have application to females in a performance enhancing context for long-term, very super low dosage exposure with, you know, almost like an Anavar replacement potentially. Potentially, this is just speculation here, and potentially for men who aren't trying to become massive bodybuilders but otherwise want access to something that may actually work, but can just get away with a far lower dosage and won't have the same liver stress, won't have the same negative interactions that happen with normal dosages of Anadrol. So anyways, if you were to use this in a acute setting to break through a strength plateau, for example, a lot of people, what they do is they pop Anadrol pre-workout, and it seems to work pretty fucking well. When you're using Anadrol sublingual, what happens is you get a more aggressive spike in plasma concentrations in a far shorter time frame. So this is something we see with methyl testosterone. When you look at the pharmacokinetics of methyl testosterone, you see like obviously the addition of the C17 alpha methyl group, steric hindrance, blah, 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 prevents metabolism. Bioavailability is about 70%, well absorbed in the gastrointestinal tract. But what we also notice with methyl testosterone is it can also be taken buccally or sublingually. Although effective orally, methyl testosterone is more effective by buccal or sublingual routes, which are said to approximately double its bioavailability and require half of the oral dosage. So the same thing could apply theoretically to Anadrol, where you can literally get away with using half the dosage, get a spike in plasma concentrations twice as high as what you would get from the oral dose, and the spike is so much more aggressive that you can actually get a more enhanced performance outcome potentially in a more compressed time frame, thus allowing you to clear it out of your system even faster, so you can not only get a doubled, you know, performance outcome pre-workout by taking it sublingual, but you skip the metabolism into mestanolone to a large extent. You get a disproportionately high anabolic to androgenic outcome, It's spiked in a disproportionately high plasma concentration. It's out of your system way faster because you took it sublingually instead of orally. And in addition to that, you're left with essentially a very maneuverable compound that you can introduce in and out of your system in an acute time frame, as well as prevents all the metabolites and whatnot. So like, obviously, if you can get a more aggressive peak plasma concentration spike in a shorter time frame with less drug, like, you're going to have a better performance outcome in an acute setting. So obviously pre-workout, it would make more fucking sense to use it sublingually because you can get it to spike in your system way harder. So you drive that performance vector during your training. And then once you're done your training and you have to shift into a parasympathetic state and not redline your sympathetic nervous system anymore, the compound is already working its way out of your system because the half-life and the like terminal fucking, the full life of it is out of your system way faster because you took it sublingually instead of orally. And you avoided that metabolism significantly into mestanolone. And you averted a significant amount of liver stress potentially. So to me, it has all of these things going for it. And then above and beyond that, circling back to the mestanolone, we don't actually know what it's, you know, like the binding affinity and whatnot and how much it contributes to the like performance outcomes in the gym. Like I don't actually fucking know for sure. But what I do know is the parent hormone is the thing that is very anabolic relative to androgenic, and mestanolone seems to be the androgenic outcome kind of metabolite hormone. And above and beyond that, oxymetholone, as we've seen in these binding assays, has such a low binding affinity that it would be extremely easy to compete with it for androgen receptor occupying the AR. So yes, like obviously the binding affinity doesn't essentially dictate, you know, what kind of response elements it can elicit. But at the end of the day, if it can't bind to AR, that is mainly how it's going to be driving its effects, aside from the, you know, metabolite interactions with glucocorticoid receptors and whatnot. But anyways, like from a hair loss context, binding to AR, causing gene expression, that is what's going to be causing androgenic alopecia. So from this oxymetholone, not only have we created a scenario in which we can get it in and out of the system much faster to avoid having perpetual, you know, androgenic environment through this, you know, mestanolone exposure. We have it in and out of the system faster with less liver toxicity potentially. We're retaining more of the parent compound, which is tissue selective in an anabolic context, and getting rid of the majority of the androgenic metabolite, which is, you know, not hair safe. But above and beyond that, we're retaining the majority of the parent hormone, which has a fucking impossible to even determine binding affinity for AR. So when you're using a topical anti-androgen like RU58841 that has a comparable binding affinity to testosterone, how easy is it to compete with something topically, locally on the scalp with something like RU58841 or CBO301 that has an undetectable binding affinity? Extremely easy. So all of a sudden we've created this scenario where a low dosage of Anadrol could potentially be used to drive really aggressive and impressive performance vectors, help break through strength plateaus, or even potentially be used in a long-term low dosage exposure scenario for females or men who are trying to avoid hair loss, and have nearly no binding affinity up here, and it can be competed with extremely easily, and you've already wiped out the majority of the metabolite hormone, which is androgenic. It's like there's so many things going for it that it seems like just I'm surprised no one, I don't know if anyone's tested it, but I mean, for somebody who would be prone to hair loss, this would be a very interesting experiment to see if this compound is well tolerated at a more reasonable dosage. Because from what I have seen, talking to coaches who do use this with their female athletes, they seem to all agree that while it isn't, the reason that women don't use it as often is less because it's an androgenic compound and more so because it produces undesired body composition outcomes. So with Anavar, you look better, you're drier, you're tighter, it's a clean compound. But in an actual tissue selectivity context, an actual side effect context, it seems like milligram for milligram, like 5 milligrams Anavar versus 5 milligrams of Anadrol, or 10 milligrams Anavar versus 10 milligrams of Anadrol, it does not seem like Anadrol produces more androgenic activity, and it potentially builds more muscle, milligram for milligram. So some of these compounds are just avoided mostly because of their androgenic, not their androgenic outcomes, but more so their body composition. Like bloating some chick in the off season is not exactly ideal for their mindset. So, you know, expectedly, they would rather choose Anavar, or most coaches just don't even know any better than what else can we fucking choose than Anavar? That's the only compound that works with females, so we gotta reach for that one. So that's what most of them are thinking. And for men, when they use Anadrol, they're thinking, I need to be taking at minimum 50 to 100 milligrams. No one's even fucking conceiving the thought process that perhaps it could be leveraged at a 10 to 20 milligram dosage and produce some sort of significant benefit. Or you can more aggressively push its bioavailability up and double it with taking in fucking 12.5 milligram. If you split a 25 milligram down the half, all of a sudden a 12.5 milligram can become as effective as 25 milligrams, or 25 as effective as 50 when it's administered sublingually. It's in and out of your system way faster, drives the performance vector way more aggressively for acute benefits in your training to break through the strength plateau. You avoid all the methanoline conversion, some of the liver stress, and then you can compete with it topically extremely easily with a topical anti-androgen because of the almost undetectable binding affinity. So it's just like, this compound has so much going for it that is not being leveraged in a more creative way, in my opinion. And the same thing could be done for, I think that's it. I think I covered all the points. But anyways, that was something I was toying around with in my head for a couple of months at this point. It's on my to-do list, been on my to-do list to talk about, but I just hadn't, I don't know. I just like, some of this shit just falls off my radar and I totally forget about it. But like, Anadrol is a really, I don't know, like it's a known carcinogen. It has a very bad reputation. Fucking nukes livers. It does not have a good reputation in the community, and it has no place in most people's protocols, according to most coaches. And, you know, to be honest, I think in the context in which it's being deployed, I also agree. It has absolutely no place in the majority of people's protocols, and the only place it really makes sense is like pre-contest, maybe in the last, like the tail end of it, for certain niche scenarios. In an off-season context, it's nearly useless for most people unless you're like somebody who's driving an acute performance benefit. If you're a power lifter, if you're a whatever, and you just like, you know, health is essentially out the window at that point. You're just trying to get a max, force production with a relative lack of giving a fuck about your health. But this is in the context of 50 to 100 milligram plus dosages being used. No one I've seen talk about this stuff at 10 milligrams. Like, people will use 10 to 20 milligrams of Dianabol. Like, why is somebody not talking about 10 to 20 milligrams of Anadrol? And if so, has anyone deployed this in a different administration route? Because that would be interesting to me. Like, the fact that methyl testosterone, you can yield double the bioavailability as you can with oral by taking it sublingually, and above and beyond that, get it in and out of your system much quicker, so you have lower amount of exposure and you can actually concentrate the performance outcome into a more aggressive time frame in a more condensed area, avoid the majority of the metabolites that are androgenic and problematic with the oxymetholone. And then above and beyond that, even if you had problems, which it seems like people don't even have problems with it, not even using hair loss prevention techniques, if you really needed to, then you take some RU58841 or CBO301 and compete topically with it, because the binding affinity is so shitty, you can compete with it easily with a topical anti-androgen. So to me, this has a significant potential in a very niche scenario, I guess, for somebody who is either the androgen sensitive, I suppose. And I think it should be explored further. I'm not saying you should do it. I'm not saying you shouldn't do anything. I'm just saying it seems like it has a lot of merit and should be explored further, because I have not seen anyone talk about it to date. And it seems like this is something I would have been all fucking over a few years ago if I knew about it. But unfortunately, I'm just learning about it now, because I don't know. My education gets better and better by the year, and I'm continuously outdating my own knowledge. And I just wish I had, stuff I'm learning about now, I wish I had access to when I was younger and was actually running this kind of shit. Because to me, this would be a very worthwhile thing to experiment with, in my opinion. But anyways, so that is my theory. Maybe I'll dig into it a bit in the future and delve into it more, but that is sort of the overall stance. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below, especially if you have done something like this. Have you used low dose Anadrol in a more longer term exposure scenario, or to drive hypertrophy? Or have you used, and when I say low dose, I don't mean like 50 milligrams, I mean like 10 to 20 at most, or 25 maybe at most? Or have you tried a different method of administration to get a more aggressive peak plasma concentration of it and potentially skip the metabolism into mestanolone through injection, through buccal, through sublingual, through rectal? Any and all feedback would be interesting as fuck to me, because this is something I wrote about it a while ago, and I don't know how I skipped over it. I don't know. I don't even know how I got back on circling back to it, because it's been on my topics list for a fucking minute, and I was just scrolling through, seeing some of my old ideas. I was like, oh shit, I haven't made a video about this. Even it was like when I first found it, I was like, holy shit, this might be like a holy grail alternative for hair loss sufferers. So I don't know, like the fact that coaches too have been telling me that it's like potentially a preferable option to low dose Anavar for females, should they actually be comfortable with the body composition outcomes in the off season and not hate themselves when they look in the mirror and see some bloat. That to me like really reinforced that that is with oral, like not even sublingual, like that's doing it orally and letting the mestanolone being created at like a 5 milligram dose. So to me, that was super fucking interesting, and sort of like maybe that was what re-sparked it, because I was talking to a few people recently about Anadrol, and some people have mentioned that, you know, potentially it may have more promise for females than Anavar, and I was like, oh, didn't I write that down like months ago? And then I went back, dug into it, and I had this topic written down. Is Anadrol the dark horse of hair safe anabolics? Is Anadrol safer than Anavar? And I had these two bolded things in all my notes below it. So interesting topic to delve into further in the future. Let me know if you guys have any experience with it, either through personal, you know, I don't know, some chick you know who's done it, that you've coached, or you've tried it yourself because you're prone to hair loss and you tried it, or you tried some sort of acute performance scenario through leveraging the administration technique to get a more aggressive spike in the peak plasma concentration. Let me know. Any and all feedback would be fascinating for me and probably some other people who are watching this video. So it's all appreciated. It helps the algorithm. Thank you guys for watching. Please like, subscribe, check out my blog, moreplatesmoredates.com. Follow me on Instagram at moreplates_moredates. Facebook, Snapchat, BitChute, Twitter, TikTok, Apple Podcasts. If you want to support the channel, you can check out anything I'm associated with in the video description below. My TRT clinic, my turnkey nootropic and pre-workout formulas, Gorilla Mind, Gorilla Mode, and anything else I am associated with. It's all in the video description below. So thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.